Today on Living History, it's Frank Hawke.
But the call I remember most making home, my dad was in the Strategic Air Command, Joint Strategic Target Planning Group, which basically wrote the nuclear war plan. So anyway, I'm in Kunming in the summer of 79. For some reason, I wanted to call home just to say hi. And so I go to the Kunming Dianbaodalo, and I started to explain where Kunming was. And he interrupted me and he said, "I know where Kunming is."
Today on Living History, we're speaking with Frank Hawke, who got offered the chance to go to China in 1978 when he was a PhD student at Stanford University. That makes him one of the earliest Americans to study in Beijing right as China reopened to the world. Over the following decades, he played a pivotal role in deepening economic and academic ties between China and the United States. He brought Chinese companies to the New York and Hong Kong stock markets, built educational programs that trained a generation of Chinese officials and executives, and was involved with some of the most consequential economic partnerships of his era. About his early days in Beijing, his work shaping US-China business education, and what he's learned from watching China rise over 4 decades, we're honored to speak with him today. Frank Hawke, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's my honor. Appreciate it, Chris.
In a previous interview, I heard something that I want to start with, and it is Thanksgiving 1978. Because I heard you got the call asking if you want to come to China. And that confused me a little bit because the reform and opening policy and Deng Xiaoping's rise was in December 1978. So it was later. And even diplomatic relations with the United States were established only in 1979. Right. So when you got that call, what was the China that you were thinking of that you were going to?
Well, it was a China that I had read a lot about. I was, as you mentioned, working on my PhD in Chinese political economy at the time at Stanford, and had finished my preliminary exams. And it's at that point in the program that historically an American would go to Taiwan to do language work, and then preparatory to doing dissertation research and writing a dissertation, and then going off and toiling in the in the groves of academia, so to speak. So I'd read an awful lot about China. Had never been to China. Had spoken to some of my Canadian colleagues who, in fact, had been in China as students in the mid-'70s, because the Canadian students were able to do that. And plus, I knew a couple of people like Carl Crook, who was at Stanford at the time, and they were able to give us some color about what Beijing was like. But that was pretty much it. And I think I intentionally kept kind of a blank slate because I didn't want to have too many preconceptions about China. And as you mentioned, the reform program was announced by Deng Xiaoping at the Sanzhong Quanhui, the third plenum, in December of 1978. But that didn't come out of the blue. There was a lot of preparatory work that led up to that. And it was clear in Deng Xiaoping's mind, I believe, that reform was a dead letter without the assistance of the United States and U.S.-led sort of Western alliance, which could provide technology, know-how, capital, all sorts of things. And that China was so far behind, it couldn't possibly catch up quickly without the help of the U.S. and its allies. So it was certainly no coincidence that on the same day, I believe, I think it was December 18th, I'm not sure, where the reform and opening up policy was announced, it was also announced that the U.S. and China would resume diplomatic relations. And of course, that doesn't happen out of the blue. That's a process where you can get to that point. As part of that process, I was vaguely aware, because I was focused on my own program, getting stuff done. But my subject being modern China, I was definitely aware that Stanford at that time was in the process of negotiating a scholar exchange program with the Academy of Sciences here in China. It was announced that Stanford had established, in fact, the first scholar exchange program between an American university and the Chinese government. And I'd heard about that. And so I was approached by my advisor, John Lewis, wonderful man. And he was involved in this process of setting up the relationship to send scholars. They said, Frank, this is happening. We're taking applications to see who would like to go, this sort of thing. And he says, I think you'd be a good applicant. Would you like to apply? I filled out the paperwork. And that was before Thanksgiving of 78. And so this was all known to us at the time, kind of, I guess I would be called an insider, maybe, not an. And so this was all known to us that this was going on. And so it was when I was at home in Tucson over Thanksgiving that John called me and said, you've been chosen, right? What do you say? And the only concern I had was, what I would do with my dog, because I wasn't going to bring him to China. And my parents, graciously said, we'll take the dog. And that was late November 78, and February 23rd, 79, I was arriving in Beijing. It was very quick.
You said you were focused on modern China. Now, that was a very different China from the China today. I believe the household GDP was $190 a year.
Yeah, as I tell my students in my class on China's economy, to give you a sense of how poor China was at that time, 1979, China accounted roughly for 24%, 23% of global population, meaning almost 1 in every 4 human beings on the planet lived in China, and yet accounted for roughly 1% of global GDP. And I actually asked my students to think about that for a moment. That's a pretty good definition of poverty. And so, that was the China that.
So then, if you were talking about modern China with people at Stanford, what were the other assumptions that you guys were making? Because most of you were literally looking across the wall. You guys weren't constantly going to China. You weren't seeing it. You were looking at it from afar.
Well, actually, that had changed by 72. When Nixon came in 72, things started to open up. So scholars were coming for short-term visits, and were allowed to do some research and that sort of thing. But so by 79, we'd already had 7 years of people gaining access to the country and are learning much more about it. So I think our view of China was much more accurate at that time than prior to Nixon's opening up. Our first-year Chinese teacher at Stanford, on their first day of class, Shou Tai, Dorothy Shou, was a wonderful woman. But there were, I think, 12 of us in the class. 6 of us were of Chinese descent, ethnically, and the other 6 kids were white kids like me. And so she's asking each one of us why we're studying Chinese. And with the Chinese kids, the answer was invariably, well, I grew up, I didn't learn Chinese, and now I want to learn Chinese. Or I grew up speaking Cantonese, and I want to learn Mandarin, whatever. Kind of a roots sort of thing. And for us white kids, it was invariably, well, I'm doing a PhD in Chinese political economy, and I have to. I kind of have to study Chinese. Except there's this one fellow who said, remind me, this is 1977, I think. He says, I'm studying Chinese because I want to do business in China. We laughed our asses off. We thought that was the funniest thing we'd ever heard, because nobody was viewing China as a place to do business at that time. It was purely a geostrategic play on the part of the United States, right, to counter the Soviets, play the China card in the relationship with the Soviets, all this going on. And nobody was seriously looking. I mean, how could you look at China seriously and think of it as a market or anything? So I always use this as an example with my students. We look at some people who are very successful, so-called entrepreneurs, and we think, oh, see how visionary they are. And oftentimes these people are actually implementing someone else's vision, who were, they had the vision, but for 1,000 different reasons couldn't get it done. Either didn't get the financing, or they're ahead of their time, or, couldn't deal with people well, couldn't put together a map, whatever. And then somebody picks up the vision and then executes it, because either times have changed or they have better skills in that regard. But yet they're considered the visionary, right? Because they made it successful. And so I always talk about, people later on would say to me, oh, Frank, back in the 70s, you had the vision to come to China and do business. And I just said, no. And I tell the story. No, I didn't the vision. I'm exercising somebody else's vision.
How long was it until you called your parents from China for the first time? Because most people didn't have phones, right? You probably had to go to Dalo.
Right. The first time I called them, I'm not sure when the first time I called them, and you're right, you just couldn't pick up the phone. There was no phone. And even the few phones there were in China didn't have access to international lines. So you had to go to what was called the Dianbao Dalo, the telegram telephone building, which is near Xidan in Beijing, and book a call. They tell you to wait, and then they'd say at some point, go to room number 4, and there'd be a phone on the desk, and you had connected your call. But I had a friend, a good friend also from Stanford, who happened to be working for the Floor Corporation, and she had an office in the Beijing Peking Hotel. And she was in the Peking Hotel. You could book a long distance call from your office through the operator. So she was very kind. That occasionally I'd come in and make a call. I'd pay her for it. I'd reimburse her for it, and it wasn't cheap. But the call I remember most making home. This requires a little bit of background. My dad was a career Air Force pilot in the Strategic Air Command. But fairly early on in his career, he became what was known as a weaponeer. And that's somebody who's involved in the targeting of nuclear weapons. And so he had his career as a weaponeer. At the same time, he kept flying. And so in the mid-'60s, he became part of the very first, what they call Joint Strategic Target Planning Group at SAC headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, which basically wrote the nuclear war plan. So he was involved in writing the first, what they called Single Integrated Operations Plan, the first SIOP, which integrated all the nuclear forces of the U.S. in a single operating plan. So anyway, I'm in Kunming. In the summer of 79, I'm taking a trip around China during the summer vacation with my good friend Stephen Alley, who was in the same group as I was. And we end up in Kunming. And for some reason, I wanted to call home just to say hi. And so I go to the Kunming Dianbao Dalo, book a call. And I get the connection, pick up the phone, my dad's voice, and my dad's, where are you? They were thrilled that I was in China. My parents were very supportive of my coming. And so my dad's, where are you? I said, I'm in Kunming. And I started to explain where Kunming was. And he interrupted me and he said, I know where Kunming is.
Oh, shit.
I said, okay. Well, that's where I am. And we had a nice conversation. Well, that was perhaps the most interesting phone call home of my stay.
Yeah. Did you stay in Kunming?
Several days.
Okay.
Yeah. No, this was 15 years after he was involved in that work. He'd already retired from military and everything, but Kunming clearly had been on some list he was involved with. Yeah.
How far had China already changed in those days?
China was just opened up and wasn't nearly as open as it is today in terms of being able to get out and meet people and make friends. I mean, at that time, the Chinese government made it very clear that there was a very narrow group of people who were permitted to deal with foreigners, who had permission to deal with foreigners. And these people obviously had been vetted, right? And if you tried to make friends outside that narrow group, you were dealing with Chinese people who didn't have permission to deal with foreigners. A year sounds like a long time, but when you attach those parameters to it, it's hard to make progress, right? In dealing with getting to know real people and understanding how the place worked. So my time was coming up, my year, and I was thinking, I really want to stay longer, but how am I going to do that? And it was at that time, I was very lucky. Again, this is luck, right? The professor at Peking University, who was responsible for my sort of academic life at Peking University, wonderful man named Hong Junyan, fairly famous guy, but had been just really, really nice to me. I remember that the first Chinese New Year I spent here was February of 1980, alone, in the dormitories at Beida. And he invited me to his home, Chinese New Year meal, just he and his wife. And at that time, Peking University faculty did not live in nice places. So it was, he was inviting me to a fairly, not terribly nice place, by Western standards. He didn't care, and I didn't care. And I'll just never forget that warmth. And he came to me at the end of that year and said, Frank, would you be interested in staying on another semester and teaching? I thought, this is perfect. This is great. I said, teach what? And then the shoe dropped. He said, I want you to teach English to my third year economics students. Now you have to understand, at that time, third year economics students were the last worker, peasant, soldier students. Okay.
The Gongbing.
The Gongbing, right? And so the first and second year students were the ones who came in through the, when the testing had restarted. I said, oh, well, okay, I'm not interested in teaching English, but okay, if that's what it takes. But then the other shoe dropped. He said, well, I want your textbook to be Samuelson. Now, Samuelson is the very famous Introduction to Economics textbook, which at that time was being used in almost every, Econ 1 course in the United States, maybe even in the Western world. By then, it was probably in its 9th edition, right? And then it dawned on me, he didn't want me to teach English. He wanted me to teach economics. But at that time, at Peking University, and all universities in China, Western economics, what we would call at the time neoclassical economics, was not permitted to be taught. It was all Marxism, Leninism in the economics programs. Now, he was a visionary. He realized that this was going to change. He wasn't sure when, and this will show what kind of wonderful person he was. He was very concerned that his older students would graduate from Peking University without having been exposed to the field of modern field of economics, and that this would disadvantage them throughout their careers versus the people coming right after them who would be exposed to modern economics and all that involves. So this was his way of getting around the rule, right? The course was going to be an English course. Well, my textbook had to be a basic economics textbook. So it was his way of saying, look, you're really going to be teaching economics. We can't call it that. We're going to call it English. And we all have plausible deniability, right? And I'm convinced his superiors knew about it too, at least within his department. I think his superiors. And so it was all like, okay, we all know what's going on here. We all have plausible deniability. And so I said, great, yeah, I'll do that. So that was the fall of 1980.
Frank, how old were you in 1980?
1980, I was 26.
I ask because a part of college life, even though for somebody going for a PhD at 26, is dating, is having friends. You just told me that a lot of Chinese people were not allowed to even speak with you, to fraternize with you. Yeah. And we had talked to Jaime Florcruz before, and he was talking about being sent down to the countryside, people not being allowed to even be alone with him not being able to hold hands with a girl. I'm not talking about anything more crass. I'm talking about the basic desire for having a companion, having a relationship. Right. That must have been extremely difficult for you because there were very few foreigners here.
Right.
And as you said, you were...
Well, I mean, I'll speak generally about it. One of the issues, sure, of course. Red-blooded American boy. What can I say? Obviously the difficulty of making friends, as I just mentioned. But on top of that, it wasn't clear that all the Chinese you met were aware of the strictures, of the restrictions. And so in some ways you had to think for them. We were very aware of it because we were butting up against these restrictions on a daily basis. Our Chinese friends weren't necessarily, that wasn't part of their daily lives. So when you'd run into a Chinese person that you might want to befriend or whatever, you actually almost had to think for them at the same time. You're thinking, maybe I'd like to have just a friendship with this person. And you'd have to think, well, what's this going to mean for them? Will they get them in trouble? And you want to understand how aware are they of the possible risks they may be taking. And so that added an extra layer to any consideration of making friends. So, while sure, you'd love to make lots of Chinese friends, you can't be chaotic about it because you might be causing trouble for them. And so you have to be very cautious if you had any sort of compassion, right, to go along with your desire to make friends. And so that was just always something to think about. The Chinese students who were in school with us obviously were in that group of people who were permitted to have contacts with foreigners. The Chinese at the time, aware that the foreigners needed some entertainment, actually organized a weekly discos. This was the time of disco, right? And so both at the Minzugong down near Xidan, and also at the International Club, Guoji Julubu in Jianguangwai, they would have a weekly sort of foreigners-only dance, right? Where they'd play recorded music, and foreigners could all show up and dance, right, and have fun and that sort of thing.
How many people would show up to?
Oh, there'd be a couple hundred. I mean, it would be quite crowded. Yeah, there were a lot of foreigners in Beijing even then. Not many Americans, but we were late to the party. So there were many foreigners in Beijing between diplomats and students and business people, and they all wanted to let off some steam. It wasn't easy to be here in many ways, so people wanted to let off some steam, and I think the Chinese realized it was probably a good idea to let them in a controlled way do that, and so they organized these dances, and Chinese weren't allowed in, but Chinese who were connected, could find their way in. There was a young guy named Xiaoping. He was the son of, I think his mother or father was German, and the other parent was Chinese. So he actually looked quite foreign, even though he was a Chinese citizen. And he rode around on a motorcycle, which was, very, very daring and romantic at the time. I remember we used to laugh because he used to be able to come into the hotel without registering because he didn't look Chinese, right? They had Chinese guards at the door in civilian clothes, and if you looked Chinese, they'd stop you. And they'd make you go. And it created quite a bit of conflict with overseas Chinese, right? Especially overseas Chinese who were dressed up as local Chinese because they wanted to go out and they wanted to, fit in. And then they'd come back to the hotel looking like a local Chinese, and then they'd be accosted by the security, and then you'd get a row because they, what do you mean I'm not, they have to show their passports and everything like that. It was even a little bit of a game sometimes, I think, people were playing. You couldn't, Chinese, the friendship store at that time was the one place that foreigners could go to buy imported products. Chinese were not allowed to go there. And at that particular time, I remember cooking oil, peanut oil, was very, very short supply. And the Chinese had a brand of cooking oil that came in large tins called Camel, Loto Par, Chao Cai You, Huasheng. And so we would go and buy many cans of it, for our Chinese friends. Also at that time, the government was still issuing ration coupons for all sorts of things like grain and edible oils and other things. Foreign students, we were also issued, because if we went out to have a meal, we would be expected to also pay in ration coupons in addition to money. And so we were issued ration coupons. The interesting thing about them is they were limited to where you lived. So Beijing had Beijing ration coupons, Tianjin had Tianjin ration coupons. So in addition to being a way of rationing scarce resources, it was always also a way to control people, because you couldn't take a Beijing ration coupon and use it in Shanghai, right? So if you went to Shanghai, you couldn't eat, right? So we would go out to a restaurant, and the waiter or waitress would ask us for our ration coupons, and we would intentionally feign ignorance and feign inability to understand. So they would just give up in service. It wasn't that big a deal. I don't want to deal with foreigners, right? So, and we would then take our ration coupons and then give them to our Chinese, roommates and people like that. But at that time, I think, especially with grain, things weren't so tight. But still, they could then use those coupons, to maybe trade them for something else as well.
Frank, I wanted to show you a moment from a previous interview that we did.
Okay.
With a then Chinese student who moved to America. It's closely related to actually what you were already telling us, but maybe take a look at it. I'll show it to you, and we'll get your reaction after.
And my first night, I went to settled in Berkeley, and my friend had something else. So I walk around. First time walk into a supermarket in Berkeley, and not too big supermarket. And I remember it was in mid-September evening, and as you know, the Bay Area is a little bit chilly, And I was wearing my mouse jacket and I walk around, look at all the sprinklers, the water, the lawns, and beautiful night. And here's a supermarket. As I walk in, I was shocked, amazed about the abundance of the food. I was counting type of ice creams, about 11 different kind of ice creams, and the soft drinks. At the time when I left China in '81, most of commodities were in rationing, and you have to get a special coupon, and to get a pair of shoes or whatever, and even eggs and sugar. Then here is it, a little tiny, not too big supermarket. I look at it, soft drinks.
Mm-hmm. First of all, that's Josh Chung. I love Josh Chung. He's like a brother to me. I have a lot of time for Josh Chung. He's terrific. I remember my first trip back to the States, and some people like to come to China and they spend 6 months or a year and they go back and they talk about the culture shock of returning to the United States. I'm sorry, I don't buy any of that. You were raised there. You're away for a year. You're going to have culture shock when you go back. I think a lot of them are trying to impress on someone the depth of their experience in China. I had such a deep experience in China that I experienced culture shock when I went home. Well, I don't buy that. You were born and raised there. Having said that, though, I only had a couple of moments, I think, ever going back to the United States and saying, oh, that's interesting. But one of them was, and it wasn't so much shock, it's just the joy of going back to the United States after a year and a half and the exact same experience. And it wasn't so much strange to me because I knew it, but it was just joy of going into the produce section of a major grocery store and just doing a slow 360. It's just look at all the colors, the vegetables, and the fruits and everything. And I wasn't shocked by it. I knew it was there. It was such a joy, after experiencing, what was available in China. I have a greai photo, during the wintertime in northern China. The only vegetable available was cabbage and maybe some turnips, 大白菜. You could freeze it. So people would buy these gigantic cabbages and they'd store them, either bury them if they had the land, or they would put them on their balconies if they lived in apartments. And they'd freeze, but then when you wanted to eat it, you pull it in, and when you peeled off the outer leaves, the inner part was still edible. And so at the beginning of the winter, you'd see these gigantic, around town, at various street corners, these gigantic piles, literally twice my height, piles of cabbage. And people just come and buy them. And then they'd be like throughout the winter time. But when it started to warm up in the spring, obviously they're going to go bad fairly quickly. And they start to defrost on the streets, and they'd be selling for like 几分钱一斤, right? Like so many cents to get rid of them. People line up. And I have this wonderful picture of this gigantic pile of defrosting cabbage, and people lined up to pay their few cents to buy it before it went bad. But yeah, compare that to a average American produce section in an average American grocery store. It's quite a contrast. And so again, like I said, it wasn't culture shock. I knew it was there, but it's just such a joy to go back and experience the contrast.
We've spoken with a couple of people about whether food back then was better because everything was local, or was worse because food safety wasn't that far advanced. Where do you come down on that?
Well, it's the combination. I don't come down on either side. It's both. This is very important. I guess I want to say my experiences are relevant, right? The important thing is the experience of 1 billion Chinese people over the last 40, 45 years. That their experience is what's important. And they're going to write the story of China in this period. People like me, I have a certain facet of it, I suppose, that might be interesting to some people, being a foreigner with something of maybe a different sort of view of things. But the real story is, 1 billion Chinese people being pulled out of poverty and, entering the modern world. And they'll write that story eventually. Nothing will compare to what they'll eventually write. And of course, back then, Chinese people did not have refrigerators. So they shopped every day or every other day for their food. Within families, there was a division of labor, right? Like, the husband would shop and the wife would cook, or vice versa. The wife would shop and the husband would cook. But there was nothing frozen. There was nothing preserved. And so the food was very, very fresh all the time. But that's one side of it. Another side of it was, what was the level of pesticides being used, or the level of human fertilizer being used, and that sort of things. There's also that side of it. Also, the variety, as I just said, was extremely limited, especially during the wintertime. But only a very slow pace of life could accommodate that, right? It's a very slow pace of life that allows you to go shopping for food every day. In addition to whatever you're doing. And this is something I talk about with my students. And I show them a photograph of friends of mine, wrapping up dumplings. And as anybody who's been involved in China knows, that making dumplings is a social enterprise as much as a culinary enterprise, because it takes lots of people doing lots of different things. It's almost like a production line, and people are chatting away and doing like that. And then I show them a picture, taken 30 years later, of many packages of frozen dumplings, right? When I first came, you wanted dumplings, somebody was making them fresh. Today, just pull a bag out of the freezer and toss it in some boiling water, and you got some actually pretty decent dumplings. But more than a reflection of how the food industry has changed, right? It's a reflection of how life has changed, and the pace of life has changed in China. When I first arrived in China, it was February of '79. The next month, there was actually, in March, we had a long weekend. And so my friend Stephen Alley, the guy I traveled with during the summer, he and I decided we wanted to go to Datong in Shanxi province to see the Yungan Shiku, the cave carvings. And so, of course, at that time, as a foreigner, you couldn't freely travel. In fact, Chinese couldn't freely travel. We had to get a letter from the Office of Foreign Students at Peking University to the Public Security Bureau, the Foreign Affairs Department of the Public Security Bureau, that said we had permission to go to Datong from Peking University, and please to issue us a travel permit, which only the Public Security Bureau could do at that time. So Steve and I, we go on, we take our little letter and go down to the Public Security Bureau, we sit down, have some tea, fill out a form, have a conversation, and they say, well, come back in 2 days. And we dutifully come back in 2 days, and there's our travel permit. Great. It's only with this travel permit now that we can go to the railroad station and buy our train tickets. And we go and we say, well, we want 2 tickets to Datong. It's a train that takes off at 9 p.m. at night and arrives at 5 a.m. in Datong. So we said, we want 2 tickets. And they said, okay, well, we'll sell you 2 soft sleeper tickets. And we said, oh, no. We want hard seat. And the ticket seller says, no, you don't. You want soft sleeper. We said, no. We want to talk to the masses, right? We don't want to be some privileged foreigners, right? We want to sit and we want to talk to the people, right? And the guy selling the tickets, his attitude was, no, you don't. You want soft sleeper. And we went back and forth. And finally, he just said, oh, okay, here's your hard seat tickets. Enjoy yourself, right? So a few nights later, we're going to come, and we figure, train's going to take off at 9. We get there at 8:45. Plenty of time, 8:30, whatever. No worry. Well, we didn't know anything. So we show up at 8:30, 8:45. We go, it's already full. Packed. Standing room only. And of course, there was an aisle. On either side of the aisle, there was a little table. And then on each side of the table, a bench seating for 3 people. Right, so you have 6 table, aisle, 6 table. So not only were all the seating, but the place was full standing up, people standing up. And it was mid-March, cold, windows were up, and everybody was smoking. So we're getting on, and we're just kind of standing there near the doorway, got on, and just not, just kind of looking around. But the conductor, comes on and he sees us, and yet he almost has a stroke because there's these 2 foreigners, right? And you have to imagine, I'm 6 feet tall, I only weigh about 170, and have hair basically down to my shoulders and wearing a cowboy hat. And Stephen, my colleague, I think he's probably about 5'6" at the most, and almost as wide as he is tall, and hair, very thick hair down to his waist, with a mustache and a goatee. He looks like he could sit down and write, Tang Dynasty poetry, at the drop of a hat if you asked him to. He's got that look. And so the conductor sees us, and like I said, almost has a stroke because he's got these two foreigners he's got to deal with that. So he takes us, and he leaves us, and he clears out an entire table of 6 people. Just clears them out and makes us sit down. Right? Now you can imagine how that makes us feel. Right? We're sitting there. I'm on one side of the table, and Steve's on the other side of the table, and beside each of us are 2 spaces that nobody's using. Nobody's sitting down. Who's going to be the first to sit down next to the foreigners, right? We're now just, oh my God, what have we done, right? And so the train takes off. The smoking does not abate in any way. And we finally convinced 4 people to sit next to us, but nobody is interested in having a conversation with us because they weren't the stratum of society that was in a position to have conversations with foreigners, right? And so that's when we realized what the ticket seller was trying to tell us. No, you want the soft sleeper. We realized not so much because it was comfortable, but that's where you're more likely to meet people who are willing to talk to you, right? And so that was a very good learning experience for us.
When did that people didn't want to talk to you start to change? When did you notice that?
That's a good question. It was very gradual, so it's hard to pinpoint one single, date. It was well into the 80s, maybe even the early 90s, before people started feeling free to talk. I remember I was on a bus one time in 1979 or 80, and coming into town, I got off the bus and was walking in a direction. And I really wasn't clear if I was walking in the right direction. So there was a middle-aged woman, maybe in her early 40s, who had gotten off, and we were very close to each other, walking in the same direction. I just happened to turn to ask her. I said, "Is this? I want to go this place. Am I walking in the right direction?" And she says, "Yes." And she kind of strikes up a conversation. "Oh, where are you from?" Literally within a minute, less than a minute, a man walked across the street and accosted her and asked her why she was talking to me, what our relationship was, how did she know me, in a very officious tone. He wasn't just curious. This was clearly his job. So that was the state of things at that time. And it gradually got better, but it was a gradual thing. I don't recall any particular turning point.
That must have been pretty hard for you in those days. You said you wanted to talk to people.
Right. Well, I did, but again, I was focused on my studies, though, also. Well, I didn't go to class because the professors had for the most part, very strong Southern accents. Remember, we had at least 1, maybe 2 professors from Hunan, and they would lecture, and even the local Chinese students would kind of, what's he saying? And so I had no chance. And so for me, it was a waste of time to be in class. And I already hadn't, had my master's degree. I didn't need the credits. I was there to learn, right? And I wasn't learning. There was a great flowering in the early 80s of journals and magazines. This was one thing that really changed rapidly. Many journals and magazines in all fields that were now being published, kind of making up for all the nonsense that had come before. So there was a post office near Xidan called Liubukou, which was a big main post office. And so every Wednesday, I think it was, I would take the bus down to Liubukou post office, and I'd just buy these journals of topics that I was interested in, mostly economics, economic management, enterprise management, all these new things going on. And I was learning to read Chinese. I mean, my Chinese was not that good, so this is my way of learning to read Chinese. So I'd get a bundle of it tied up, and it was very close to a halal restaurant called Hongbinlo, and just down the street. So I'd time it so I'd get my magazines, it'd be around noontime, and then I'd go on over to Hongbinlo. And if it were wintertime, I would have a hot pot, Hawke. And if it were summertime, I'd have their lamb pot stickers, yang rou guotie. But the hot pot was hilarious because there's this big table that gets 10 people around, and it'd be one big hot pot, and it'd be partitioned into 10 partitions. And you would order what you wanted, and you would just use your partition, right? Like that. And there'd be people right next to you. You're really cheek by jowl, right? And by the end of the winter, because I'd be wearing this coat, this heavy cotton coat. And by the end of the winter, the sleeves of my coat would be encrusted with the sauce and everything else, because I'd been, dipping and dipping. And a few conversations, there'd be kind of fun, because people would be looking at me like right next to me, like, well, who are you? Where are you from? Right? Just have some fun conversations. But then I just, after lunch, go back to my room at the Peking University, my dormitory room, and I just translate all day long. Just translate with the help of dictionaries. There was a wonderful dictionary, actually, that was quite famous at that time. It had just come out. It had been produced by the Foreign Languages Institute, been produced by a group led by David Crook. And it was the first dictionary that was Chinese to English. It was Chinese to English, organized by pinyin and all the pinyin pronunciations. So it was exactly what a student like me would need. And it was kind of the first of its kind. And it was so valuable. I actually bought, I think I bought 6 or 7 copies. I have copies of this dictionary practically everywhere in the world where I might be at any time, just so it's there, right? And at that time, now, of course, there are many dictionaries that are out that do that. But at that time, it was the only one. And so it was great. So I'd sit there with my dictionary and I just translate, for hours. So it wasn't like I was out there prowling the hutongs looking for Chinese people to make friends with. I was very busy doing my own thing at Beida, trying to up my language skills and stuff like that. In fact, that was a funny experience. The Chinese were preparing to participate in the Moscow Olympics in 1980, which was going to be China's first Olympics in a long time. And I was on the Beida Peking University basketball team, and we were pretty good. We were undefeated and pretty good. Some good athletes on that team. I was very impressed. And all of a sudden, the Chinese national women's basketball team shows up because they were preparing to go play in the Olympics, and there were no women's teams who could compete with them, right? So they were going around playing men's teams to get ready, to get prepared, and they came and played us. So we were playing, and it was just a great experience. The gym was full of people, and normally we played in front of very sparse crowds. Plus, in China at that time, there was a custom that you would always play on a neutral court. So I played for Peking University. If we played Tsinghua, we would play at Renda, at People's University, right? And the whole idea was, friendship first, competition second. But I think the real idea was to, avoid the breakout of fights. And so we were always playing on a neutral court. And I remember one time that we were playing at Renda, and I was thinking, all these soldiers surrounding the court watching the game, they're all PLA soldiers at People's University, right? And at no other place did we encounter that. It's just, ringed by soldiers, right? And after the game, I remember asking somebody, and I learning that, the Second Artillery, the Nuclear Rocket Forces headquarters, was located on the campus of People's University before it was, moved out. But that time it was still there, and so there were all these PLA soldiers on the campus of People's University that came to see our game. But this game with the national women's team was at Peking University, so there's all these Peking University students there playing, and it was just a lot of fun. It was weird playing with women. Wasn't used to that, and I think we were a little bit nonplussed at first, and that's just how hard we could play. But then after, I got a couple of elbows thrown at me, and all of a sudden we said, "Oh, all right, okay," and we had a real game at that point, and it was fun. It was tremendous fun. Yeah.
So in those days, what if the foreigners won? I mean, you said you guys were unbeaten.
Oh, we beat them. It wasn't even close.
And?
Well, no, but I was the only foreigner on the team. Myself and Jimmy Flor Cruz. Jimmy and I were the only 2 foreigners on it. No, so it was a Chinese team that beat them.
Yes.
It was all Chinese, except for Jimmy and myself. It was all Chinese.
When did basketball become so wildly popular as it is today?
Michael Jordan. I think he really popularized the game because he was just so beautiful to watch. I mean, it's airborne ballet, really, when you look at people like Michael Jordan, and greatly popularized the game. And then it was the dream team, 92 Olympics, I think, that galvanized the entire world, and not just China, kind of behind basketball. I knew some of the people on the national team here, and the very first Chinese drafted by the NBA was a fellow named Song Tao, 6'11", and he was drafted by the Atlanta Hawks. He was the first Chinese big man who was a legitimate athlete. Prior to that, they had, big guys, but they weren't very athletic. They all had issues. They were just, they just had glandular issues. They were. But Song Tao was very slender, very good athlete, and so the Hawks had seen him in some international competitions, and they drafted him in the second round. Well, I happened to know him. He was a good friend of mine. And so I had my dad contact the general manager of the Atlanta Hawks, a guy named Stan Kasten, very famous guy in American professional sports. And my dad said, well, I noticed you drafted Song Tao from China. He said, yeah, but we have no way of contacting him. And my dad said, well, my son knows him. And Stan jumped at it. He said, yeah, can we, send him the rookie. He actually signed the NBA rookie contract in my apartment, which probably violated 10 Chinese laws at the time. I don't know. And then a couple of weeks later, Song Tao was practicing with the national team, and he fell and shattered his kneecap. And so I got in touch with Stan Kasten at Hawks. I said, this is your boy. I mean, maybe you want to fly him out and, give him some tips on how to, recover and that sort of thing. So they did. They flew him to Atlanta, and he spent a week working with the team and the team doctors and stuff. And then he flew to Tucson, my hometown, and spent over a month living with my parents and took some English classes at the University of Arizona, and Chinese students at the University of Arizona were like, that's so dumb. And then he came back to China and continued to, rehab and play for the national team. But he never actually stepped on an NBA court.
That answers probably my next question, because I had thought Ma Jian was the first NBA player from China.
No, I mean, not for the NBA. He was the first Chinese player to play Division I basketball at the college level. Now, Division I just means the highest level of college sports. So he went to play. He originally got a scholarship at UCLA, and then he ended up going to junior college because his English wasn't good enough. Going to junior college in Utah, and then ended up playing for the University of Utah. Tried out twice for the LA Clippers. Was cut twice, and so he never stepped on a basketball court in a regular season NBA game. The first one to actually step on a court in a regular season NBA game was Wang Zhizhi.
You'd said nobody was thinking of China being a place to do business.
Well, very few people.
And yet, joint ventures like Beijing Jeep happened. How did that happen?
Well, business people for centuries have had visions of the China market, right? Going back centuries. And so that never changes. And so as with the opening to China, naturally the captains of industry are going to start thinking, oh, wow, now we can go do business in China. What does that mean for us? And so they started strategizing. Okay, we have this product or we have this service. How can China fit into our sort of global thinking about how we want to, build out our business? Prior to 1972, we couldn't think of China. Nixon goes to China. Oh, well, we can start thinking about China, whether as a market or as a source of things or as a place to produce or a combination of all three of those things. So people inevitably were thinking about that very early on once the opening started. And that's how I got my first job. I mean, working for a company whose business was to help companies do that. Strategize about China, build a strategy and then help them implement it.
Clear. But at the same time, what intrigues me especially about that deal is that a Jeep or something like that would cost $10,000, $15,000 in those years. And the household GDP was perhaps $300 at that time.
Well, no, you have to understand, the Jeeps weren't being produced for personal consumption. Automobiles weren't owned by individuals in China. That didn't even start until probably the Jeep joint venture was already in operation. No, these were Jeeps for the purpose of the government, buying vehicles, various organizations within the government. The company I joined after I left Peking University was called Unison International. It was owned by two individuals, C.B. Sung and his wife, Beulah Kwok Sung. She was the scion of the Kwok family that owns the Yong'an Empire, the Wing'an Empire in Hong Kong, and also they had a big department store in Shanghai before the revolution. And they both grew up in Shanghai. They didn't know each other in Shanghai, but they met when they both went to Boston to study. She was at Juilliard, I think, as a pianist. And CB was at MIT, I think he got his degree in engineering, and then went to Harvard Business School, and then launched a very successful business career. I think at one point he may have been the most high-ranking or successful Chinese-American businessman in the United States, before Wang An came on with Wang Computers, right? And so once China opened up, the Chinese government was very interested in what they called defense conversion. Much of their industry was focused on producing war materials. And they realized as part of the reform program, they were going to have to convert a lot of that from producing tanks and artillery to producing, refrigerators and, motorbikes and things like that. And so CB, because of his experience working in various industries in the United States, was invited to China to give talks about defense conversion. And his wife, Beulah, would come, and then she started doing some business on the side. And this developed into their companies. Right? And so, after my semester of teaching at Peking University, I still wanted to stay. And I happened to know their son, who was at the Beijing Languages Institute when I arrived. They had used their kind of personal connections to get him into the Beijing Languages Institute. And we became good friends. And at that time, they had one gentleman working here full-time named Richard Young, Dick Young. Well, he had a prior commitment to take some old war colleagues from the war to go back to Yunnan and kind of go over the hump, reenact sort of the hump and flying the hump and the Burma hump and that sort of thing. So that was so he was going to be gone for a couple of weeks. So there wasn't going to be anybody in the office. They knew me through their son. Hey, Frank. I was still at Beida at the time. Hey, Frank, you want to come spend a couple of weeks in the office, take phone calls? Here's a list of things that are likely to come up. Here's how you go down and send a telex. Just babysit the office for a couple of weeks. And I'm thinking, wow, hot showers every day. That was for me, just say no more. I mean, I don't even know if they paid me. I think they paid me something. Maybe they didn't. I mean, it didn't matter. I would have done it for free. And so, a couple of things came up that were unexpected that I handled and, did, I guess, a decent job. And they were at that point where they were thinking, well, maybe we need somebody else, permanently in Beijing. And our business on the consulting side was becoming busy enough that Dick can't handle everything. So they hired me. And it turns out at that time, they were already helping American Motors in their discussions with the Beijing Automotive Industrial Corporation, which owned the factory that owned the Beijing Auto Works, which produced a knockoff of a Russian knockoff of a White Motors Jeep, the Beijing 212, Beijing RER, which was ubiquitous around town. These green kind of army Jeeps, just ubiquitous. And so when American Motors came to China, they were naturally channeled, go talk to them. I think those discussions had been going on for maybe half a year when I joined Unison. We finalized the joint venture. It was during those 4 years that it was my account. It was one of my accounts. So when the American Motors guys would come over, I would accompany them, negotiate, translate. There are a lot of reasons it took 5 years to negotiate. A lot of reasons. Okay. I mean, we're talking about, I think it was a $38 million joint venture. That took 4 or 5 years to negotiate. One of the reasons was that Beijing Jeep initially said, look, this is how we want to do this. And we've done this in other places and it's worked. And so let's do it here. Let's start off with a KID program. And a KID program is simply, we basically take a Jeep in the United States and we basically knock it down into parts, ship the parts over, and then we assemble it here and then sell it in China. And there are two kinds of kits. There are what they call CKDs, which are completely knocked down, and SKD, semi-knockdown kits. And so you start with SKDs and then you work to CKDs. And then at the same time, you're trying to replace parts in the kit with parts made in China, as opposed to shipping. So gradually, you're trying to create, over time, a Jeep that's mostly produced in China. But you start out with one that's produced in the United States. And while you're doing that, you're going out and sourcing in China for different parts that you can now substitute for the parts coming in from the US, increasing the national content, which presumably brings down the cost and all sorts of things. So, and American Motors says, look, this really works. The advantage is we're up and running quickly. We can get Jeeps on the road really quickly. There's a minimum capital requirement, so there's not a lot of commitment, from a financial point of view. And it gives us an opportunity for our engineers to work together in a fairly simple context and all sorts of advantages. And the Chinese response was no, we're not some banana republic, that assembles Jeeps, for you capitalists, right? I don't think the word capitalist was used, but that's kind of the tone, right? No, we know how to make cars. And they would point to the cars that China was making, whether it was a Shanghai, or the Chinese version of a Volga, right? No, we know how to make cars. We're not going to just assemble cars from you. So we have to have a car from the ground up, engineered from the ground up and designed for China. Otherwise, there's going to be no deal. So, okay, so Jeeps enough. Now you can imagine how that now elongates the process, right? Now we get all our engineers in, all our designers in, sit down with our Chinese counterparts, and basically come up with a plan, which took a long time, and eventually came up with a 3-phase plan. Phase 1 was going to be, which were all going to happen at the same time. Phase 1, we're going to take the Beijing 212 and basically, fix it up cosmetically, right? Just to make it look nicer and that kind of thing. At the same time, they were working to retrofit the American Motors 6-cylinder engine into the Beijing 212, right? So to increase the performance, but which means you have to, interface with their drivetrain and all that sort of thing. It's going to take some work, right? But, hopefully that wouldn't take too long. So you'd end up with a Beijing 212 with an American Motors engine in it. And at the same time, other engineers were working to design a new Jeep from the ground up, right? A Cherokee or something like that. 3 months, 6 months after the joint venture starts, we have the first board meeting of the joint venture. And the president of American Motors comes to officiate the board meeting. His name was Joe Cappy. And of course, you know how these things work. The agenda's already done before the seniors show up. It's all the agenda items are all negotiated and the documents prepared. And seniors just show up, sign, and toast and this kind of thing. So I'm translating at the board meeting for Mr. Cappy. The Chinese head of the joint venture, the actual chairman of the joint venture, is a wonderful man, Wu Zhongliao. So Mr. Cappy is, okay, well, agenda item number 1, let's get started. And Mr. Wu says, excuse me, in Chinese, he says, I've got a non-agenda item I'd like to discuss. And I say to Mr. Cappy, I said, Mr. Wu has a non-agenda item. Of course, Mr. Cappy says, go ahead, Mr. Wu. And Mr. Wu starts on a little sort of soliloquy about how, it took us so long to negotiate this joint venture, and it's now been in operation, whatever it was, 3 or 6 months. And our leaders have come to us and they said, where are the Jeeps? And I could feel Joe Cappy kind of getting really unhappy next to me, because I know what he's thinking. He said, well, if you'd listened to us 4 years ago, right, there would have been Jeeps on the road for 4 years, right? So he started to get a little agitated. And I literally kind of just nudged him, because I thought I knew what was coming. I said, Mr. Wu isn't finished. He said, oh, okay, go ahead, Mr. Wu. Right. And so Mr. Wu says, well, we have an idea. What's your idea, Mr. Wu? We would like to do a kit program. and of course, that's money in the bank for American Motors, right? Because the kits have to be paid for. They're not going to send kits over without them being paid for, right? And so all of a sudden American Motors is just, this is fantastic, right? Because we're going to get, we were worried about, at what point are we going to start making money with the way this thing is currently structured? It's going to be a while before we get Jeeps on the road, right? Now they're saying they want kits. Well, it can be Jeeps on the road within 3 months that some people are going to be paying for, right? So, American Motors is over the moon, right? Over this new thing. And I always talk about, especially back then, the Chinese Americans were coming to the table with very different goals. For Americans, it's profits and return to shareholders, right? By doing this, we think we can increase our return to shareholders. End of story. Yeah, end of story. Well, whatever. Depends on how visionary you are and how much you can convince shareholders and investors. But the Chinese, that wasn't their goal at all. In fact, they really didn't understand that goal. You could sit down and talk to them about balance sheets and income statements and returns to shareholders. But our task is to get the technology. We want to learn how to build cars better. We don't really care if you're making money or not. We understand that's kind of what you have to do, but that's not our goal. So, it was always a tension, right, in trying to develop a deal where both sides get what they want when they want very different things, okay? And there's a lot of landmines in that eventually when you start actually working and solving problems, right? Because problems would come up and the U.S. side was always, well, gee, we want to solve this problem with a view toward, enhancing our profitability, where the Chinese, what they wanted necessarily wouldn't enhance the profitability. And so just one issue on that was the Chinese always wanted the most advanced technology. And the U.S. side would say, well, gee, A, maybe we don't want to give you our advanced technology, but B, maybe that's not the most profitable way to roll out this product in China. Using the most advanced technology is not the most profitable way to do it, right? Maybe we want a different generation of technology would be faster, easier to service, easier to build, right? And the Chinese, our instructions is to get the most advanced technology. So it's all these kinds of issues that came up when you have parties coming together with different goals. The environment for an entrepreneur in the United States or elsewhere in the West and here was very, very different in terms of trying to start up a company that might have been a traditional company. The hand of the state is so heavy. You're dealing with the state every step of the way. And so therefore, the work you have to do to get something up and running is very different. The only way for a foreign company to come in and invest was through the joint venture mode. It seemed like the promised land because the foreigners were going to bring the financial capital, the technology, the know-how, all that stuff. And the Chinese were going to bring the labor, the factories, the physical capital, the land, and the market. It was a match made in heaven. I couldn't get any better than this. We were all going to ride up into the sunset, right? And it didn't happen. 30 years later, nobody's doing joint ventures. Nobody in their right mind would do a joint venture. Everybody tries to do, wholly owned, unless the regulatory environment requires you to joint venture. Nobody's going to do a joint venture. They always want to control things. And so I did a lot of hard thinking about why, what happened? And we're having these conversations 30 years ago, and it seemed like a match made in heaven. What happened? Well, if you look at those various things, financial capital, okay, well, I think there's a sense on the Chinese that the foreigners were made of money, right? And were rich and just would throw money at China. And that's not the case. It never is the case. People look at these things hard, right? So make sure there's a good return. So the money didn't flow as freely as the Chinese may have hoped. And then you have the technology. Well, the foreign parties weren't going to give the technology to the joint venture. They wanted to be reimbursed for the technology. So how do we do that, right? And what's the value of the technology? And so those ended up being very hard negotiations. And sometimes you couldn't get to an agreement, and so the deal wouldn't get done. So those were obstacles and problems. What I think the main issue was in management philosophy, how you manage an organization in these two very different environments. In the West, the United States anyway, companies compete on a level playing field. Companies lobby the government constantly about regulations and preferential treatment, but you generally get it for the entire industry. In the United States, you wouldn't get it. You get it for the oil industry or the car industry, right? GM's not going to get it at the expense of Ford, right? Because somebody would sue, right? So in the West, companies are operating on basic playing fields. So when you're on an even playing field, that company that manages itself internally the best is going to win. Well, when you come to China, you find it's kind of a different situation, right? Where in China, because the state is so involved in so much, that actually a company can actually get an advantage over its competition. It can make the playing field unlevel in its favor by getting, for example, special access to a raw material, right? Or special access to a license. Or there are 1,000 things that determine the success of a company that are in short supply or that are rationed. And if you have the relationship with the person in the government that controls that, and you can get a favorable decision, then your company is now advantaged. So you're talking about, so that means that a lot of work by senior managers is spent on making the playing field unlevel in their favor. So they're very outwardly focused. And if you can make the playing field unlevel in your favor, it doesn't matter how you manage internally, right? You're going to do very well, right? So I think this sort of management philosophy in many ways was what really kind of undermined a lot of sort of joint ventures and then how we go about managing this thing. Not completely. I mean, there are these other obstacles as well. But I think that was, and the other obstacles, I think at that time we sort of anticipated. This one, I don't think we anticipated so much, that this sort of the management philosophy obstacle would come up as companies tried to operate joint ventures.
If management styles were so different, and you also had previously explained the importance of immediate financial returns, then that must mean that building trust among joint venture partners, Chinese and foreigners, must have been very difficult.
Very difficult and very important. You know, the Chinese have this old saying, "Tong chuang yi meng," one bed, two dreams, right? So we're in the same bed, but we're dreaming different dreams, okay? And so what that means is even if you can get to a joint venture agreement, no matter how in line the two partners' goals are, in the best of situations, you're going to run into problems. The joint venture agreement is just a roadmap, right? And any complex joint venture, you're going to run into issues that the contract doesn't anticipate. And you just got to discuss it out. You got to talk about it. You got to agree. So in any joint venture, trust is important as you go through the process of solving problems. But especially in a situation where you start with different dreams to begin with, that just means the problems are going to start immediately. And so the two partners have to come together and trust one another, as you said. That, okay, I trust you. I know you're going to have different goals, but at the end of the day, we want to do the right thing for the joint venture. And we're going to have to make maybe some compromises, right? But because I trust you and you trust me, I know you're not going to ask for too much. I'm not going to ask for too much. Okay, let's move forward. And I think that's always for a long time when people ask me, what's important about doing business in China. That's the whole trust issue is absolutely critical if you're going to do anything complicated in China. You have to build that trust. And I've actually a couple of interesting stories about that. One is I call him a wildcatter, came in and negotiated a joint venture deal in the aluminum industry in China, which he couldn't do. And so basically, it had all been negotiated, right? And then the Chinese went to a major company in the West and said, here's the deal, take it or leave it, right? All negotiated, take it or leave it, right? And they took it. And they spent more time getting out of the deal than they spent getting into the deal, because they didn't build any trust. They didn't spend any time. There's this deal is already negotiated, basically handed to them on a silver platter. There are things about it they didn't care for, right? But they said, okay, it's good enough. Say we want to spend years to go. Okay, this is great. They took the deal. But, now you've got all these issues that are going to come up, and they didn't know the partners. So very quickly they said, we got to get out of this deal. It took them forever to get out of it.
And is this the kind of moment where you would get a call back in those days, help us?
Well, actually, I'd introduced them, a friend of mine introduced them to be their CFO, a guy who really knew his stuff in China. So, they already had, I think, enough help. But the other situation, which was, an embarrassing situation for me, was when I was at Salomon Brothers. At that time, the Chinese were just going to Hong Kong, doing the red chips listing in Hong Kong and New York, and they had, Chinese companies that had been approved to go overseas, and they were sort of parsing them out to the various investment banks to be the lead underwriters, right? So we got Datang Power, which is the big power company in Beijing. Well, at that time when I joined Solomon, all the investment banks purported to do the same things, whether it was equity capital markets or fixed income, which are bonds or whatever. But they did them with very different personalities that reflected their unique histories. Liar's Poker is a good reflection of the Solomon Brothers culture. Very transactional, very transactions driven, versus say a bank that'd be more relationship driven. What they would call the white shoe banks, like Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley, like that. Solomon was very transactional. His personality was, and very much let's get this transaction over with and move on to the next one. We'll worry about the relationship later, right? Now that's not a culture that really does well in China, as you know, because China is very much a relationship-driven culture. Now I knew none of this when I was hired by Solomon Brothers. I Solomon Brothers, great, I'll go work for Solomon Brothers. Right? So we had already been given the mandate when I joined Solomon to be the lead underwriter for the Datang Power and its listing in Hong Kong. And an American investor might be interested in your company, but he doesn't want to change dollars into Hong Kong dollars and have to go to an exchange that's 12 time zones away. And it's complicated. So you list in Hong Kong, but then also on the stock exchange, you list what they call an ADR, which is dollars. So that makes your stock much more available to investors in the United States, which increases your pool of investors. But the process at this time of taking a state-owned company and converting it into a company that can go overseas and actually list on the stock exchange, I mean, the legal and financial burden of doing that was incredible. You can imagine, you got this state-owned behemoth, and now you got to turn into a company that foreign investors can actually understand. So I joined Solomon. I'm put on the deal team, right, to basically facilitate the discussions. We're constantly meeting with the Chinese, our lawyers and accountants, and so I'm there. And all of a sudden, our managing director, who's running the whole thing, leaves to go to another bank. And I get a phone call saying, "Frank, you're now running the team." I've been in an investment bank for probably, I think it was 6 months or something like that. And now I'm running a deal team on one of the biggest, most high-profile listings that there is, right? The company that probably powers this building, right? So, we just spend months and months and months doing this, getting the prospectus together. So it comes time to price the deal. Okay, now, I had sent, when I got this job, I was put in touch with this team. I actually wrote a memo to my boss in Hong Kong saying, because I'd been part of it, and I saw, man, we need some relationship building resources here. We got the right technical people involved from Solomon, really good people, they know what they're doing. But I'm concerned about the relationships at the senior level, their trust in us at the senior level of the client. And so I wrote a memo saying, I think over the next several months, we need these people flying in from New York. We need you guys flying in from Hong Kong, just to sit down and do some hand-holding with the seniors of the Chinese company, just to build the trust. Because we got the technical stuff right, but the trust, I don't think, is quite there. Well, I ended up getting essentially none of that, again, because of this culture, right? Solomon didn't really have a strong relationship-driven culture. It was more, well, okay, when's the transaction going to happen? It's going to happen maybe in 6-9 months. Oh, I'll come out then. But no. We need you out there now, right? Well, I don't have time because I've got these other transactions I'm doing, right? So and it was that kind of culture. So we get to the pricing period, the time to price it. Now you price it, a new listing, you price it off the closest comparable you can find that's already in the market. Makes sense, right? So you find a company that's very similar to this company, and then you price it at a discount to that because you want to attract investors, either investors who are in that company and they say, I can get a similar company cheaper. So they'll sell the shares of that company and come and buy your company. Or you'll attract investors who didn't want to be in the industry because they thought it was too pricey. Now you're coming in a little cheaper. Oh, now it's not so pricey. Now I'll come and invest in a Chinese power company, right? So that's why you price it at a discount to the comparable. And at that time, there was a good comparable in the market called Huaneng. It had gone ahead of us. It was a Chinese power company. And so we sat down with our client and said, look, here's the price of Huaneng in the market, and we think we should discount it a certain percentage off of that. The trouble was, at that time, the whole market was down. So everybody's stock prices were down for Chinese companies. So we were pricing off a comparable that was historically at a low, and then discounting off of that. Now, the net effect of that, when you looked at the overall picture of the company, was the company would be going to the market at a price that reflected a value of the company that was lower than its net asset value. And that wasn't permitted. The Chinese regulator would not permit that. And we tried to explain this to our client, right? It says, no, this is the right thing to do. It's just this is where the market is, and they fired us. They didn't believe us, right? Because we hadn't built the trust. I had the honor of leading the only, underwriting team that got fired in this whole batch of Chinese companies, right? And they hired Morgan Stanley. Of course, Morgan Stanley had to come in and kind of redo a lot of stuff just so it could be in their name. They just couldn't take, so it took a few months, right? Now, by the time they go to the market's up. They priced at the exact same discount to the comparable. And it was a successful listing, right? So as a perfect example of, a distilled example of what I like to say, we were right on, technically. Our people were right on, as evidenced by the fact that when they did go to the market, it was the exact same discount to the comparable. But because we didn't have the trust, we hadn't built the trust, that our client didn't believe us. They weren't willing to believe us. No, it was somehow our fault. We weren't pricing it right? And it was a big deal within Solomon at the time. We lost this deal. It was very embarrassing loss. And not long after that, the CEO of Solomon came out to Hong Kong, a guy named Derek Mon, Sir Derek Mon. Wonderful guy. I'd met him already, and he knew me. And I get a call from my boss, Frank, come to Hong Kong. Derek wants to meet with you. I'm like, oh, geez. So I fly down to Hong Kong. But before I leave the office, I take that memo I'd written many months earlier, asking for these resources, and I put it in my pocket. And I walk into the boardroom of Solomon Brothers in Hong Kong, and there's Sir Derek Ma by himself waiting for me. And I walk in, it's just the two of us. Hi, Frank, how are you? Fine, Derek, how are you? How's the family? Okay. Frank, let's talk about .com. Right? And I was ready, quite frankly, to resign that day. I was so unhappy. And so I wasn't, I'm a generally polite person, but I was on the edge of not being polite, right? And I said, Derek, what have you heard? Throw a question back at him, right? And he says, well, and he told me what he had heard. And it was the thing like, oh, it was all the fault of the guys out in Asia, right? It was, it was those guys' fault. And they were right. They weren't wrong, because it was our job to build a relationship, right? And so I literally interrupted him halfway through his little monologue. I said, anyway, just showing how the state of my mind. I literally interrupted him. I said, okay, Derek, okay. I said, I didn't want to show you this. And I pulled the memo out of my thing, and I literally flicked it across the table at him. Right? He looks at it, and he reads a very short memo. He says, did you get any of this? Any of these resources? I said, didn't get any of them. He says, is this for me? I said, it's for you. Put it in his pocket. He said, let's talk about other things. Oh, you're okay. Let's talk about other things. But again, the importance, back then and even now, is building the relationships of trust. Because we were dealing with people on the Chinese side who had no experience in listing a company. They had very little, they were engineers. This was totally new to them. And yet they've been giving this instruction, go list the company. And by the way, you can't do it yourself. You got to trust some foreigner to do it, right? So they were very, 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 they just had no idea to evaluate what we were doing and how we were doing it, and made them very uncomfortable because they felt they weren't in control, right? Because these guys were engineers and having to go through us, and we gave them the right information, and it was very difficult for everybody all around. So making it even more important to build that trust.
So then you came initially for 1 semester?
1 year.
1 year.
Yeah.
Then you extended, you started teaching.
Right.
When did you realize, oh, this is for me, I'm going to be here for a long time?
Well, it was phased. Initially, the job was, just the job was, because everything we were doing was the first time it had ever been done. Right. Now, again, that would frustrate a lot of people because it's not smooth. Right. I remember with the Beijing Jeep joint venture, they didn't have a joint venture law yet. They were drafting it as we were negotiating a joint venture contract. They were drafting a joint venture law, right? Now, there's a lot of ambiguity there, right? So you've got to be willing and even find the ambiguity a little bit fun, right? It may be some opportunities in the ambiguity, right? But if you're not comfortable with that, go, stay home, right? So yeah, we would be negotiating the joint venture, just hours after hour after hour, trip after trip after trip. And all of a sudden, the Chinese side would put an issue on the table that came out of nowhere. Just came out of nowhere, had nothing to do with what we've been negotiating, really didn't have much to do with the joint venture itself, right? And we learned that what was going on was, we thought, pretty sure that in drafting the joint venture law on the Chinese side, they had come up with this issue and couldn't decide what to do. And we were the biggest negotiation in town. Let's throw it at the American Motors guys, see what they say. And so we became aware of the fact that we were not only negotiating for American Motors, we actually, to a certain extent, were negotiating for people coming after us. And so we'd have to take these issues very seriously, even though they might not be a serious issue for this joint venture. We came to learn that, okay, our response was going to be very important for the way the Chinese see this issue, for all joint ventures. So we would, have to be careful to respond accordingly. You don't get that anywhere else, right? We were negotiating the contract from zero. The nice thing about having a joint venture law is all the stuff in the law you don't have to negotiate. It's in the law, right? So we just, copy and paste, right? To the extent, we were negotiating everything, which is another reason it took so long. Said there are many reasons for it taking so long. Well, that was another reason. You're negotiating from scratch. Every word in the contract is brand new, has no basis in anything outside of it, like the law or anything like that, or precedent. And so I would always tell my students, China's not for everybody. It's not for everybody, and that's okay. If you're more comfortable dealing with people who are similar to you and have similar thoughts and backgrounds, do it. If you like this stuff, right? Come on in. Water's warm. There's an endless opportunity for being fascinated and charmed and all sorts of things. But you got to have that mindset. You're exploring, constantly exploring.